Good afternoon and welcome to Bridgecast. We are super excited that you are here with us. Today it's just going to be me. I'm going to be gauging with how place-based learning interacts with Bridge Builders as a whole. A couple of things before we go into it. Again, a special thank you to everyone who participated in the medic training we had a couple of weeks ago. In addition with Shared Streets and What's Young Adult Ministries, we were able to have a really cool event with 14 people present. Learning medic skills, baseline medic training to how to engage and stabilize individuals just by walking up to them and learning triage and learning how to identify wounds and how to stabilize those wounds and injuries going forward. Something else is that it's time for us to pull a raffle. Again, thank you to everyone who's been participating in that raffle. This week we have some beautiful earrings made by Kayla Howe from the Sioux YMCA in South Dakota on the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe Reservation. The Sioux YMCA is once again one of our closest partners in our exchange programs and is incredibly meaningful to us to be able to raffle off this jewelry. So it's time to pick that. And the winner is Shaylee Parsons. Shaylee, thank you so much for engaging with our raffle, and Josephine, our Director of Development, will be reaching out to you soon on how to get these earrings to you. We will have another raffle ready next week, and that is sort of how we'll continue to be developing along with this development for Bridge Builders. Again, I want to reiterate that this is one of the best ways to fundraise for the Run for St. Louis Dupree Exchange Program right now, since the Run for Dupree was canceled because of COVID-19. So please continue to engage in that raffle, and we're incredibly thankful to everyone who has been able to participate so far. So let's go into our conversation for today. This is sort of me just sort of passing along some information about the work that we've been doing in quarantine and through our isolation. Right now is sort of close to that time. I believe within the next week would be when we'd be leaving for the St. Louis Dupree Exchange Program. But in lieu of that and extending out that exchange program to next year, we've been doing some work along the lines of place-based learning. And place-based learning is a new learning theory that I've been discussing with Dr. Kim Kleiman and in collaboration with Ethan DeMumbrum. We have been working on a research project that based on the idea of three main tenets, and those three main tenets are places are rich in history, cultural, and traditions. The second one is that places continue to develop and change over time and are always developing. And the third is that humans are placemakers. And ultimately where these three tenets come from is from research that Dr. Kleiman and Dr. Vestrobel are working on at Webster University, and we are now sort of engaging with them further in this way. One of the reasons that we think that it's so important that we are engaging with place-based learning and the educational theory that it is because of how well it fits in with Bridge Builders STL. Our exchange programs are ultimately based on the idea that communal living, cultural immersion, going to a location and spending more time with the community there will ultimately give us a better understanding of places as a whole. And so looking at 2 weeks with 2 sites for each 1 week spending in each location, this further diversifies and also at the same time allows for participants to engage with their homes, their places, their communities, and also immerse themselves in another culture, another community. In the lens of our St. Louis Dupree Exchange Program, our St. Louis team gets to spend a week in Dupree, South Dakota, which is a community very different from St. Louis, and the Dupree team gets to spend a week in St. Louis. What we tend to find out throughout these 2 weeks is that these two communities actually have a lot more in common than we originally think, even though there is that initial sort of dissidence in the two communities and how they present themselves, with, of course, Dupree being rural and St. Louis being urban, an indigenous community making up a prominent part of Dupree, having that Lakota culture that exists within the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe reservations, where St. Louis has a heavy refugee population from the Bosnian community, and has other communities at play. And we talk heavily about the segregation that exists within St. Louis, looking into the Del Mar Divide and other neighborhood lines that sort of make up St. Louis, and those strong communities that exist within there. And we see St. Louis being a sort of unique city in this way, especially looking at research around 2014 with the killing of Michael Brown and the protests that followed. And so in our current climate that exists right now with Black Lives Matter and the current unrest happening around our nation, we see a continuation of these issues between the difference between neighborhoods, between different communities, and on the issue of race. So we tend to see that between the Standing Rock protest and between the protests that happened in Ferguson and within Missouri, we see similar issues arising. We see similar issues of land, of community, of place being a part of this. So that's why I think that place-based learning is such an important thing for bridge builders to be studying and engaging with and researching right now. And when I say research, it's not really just saying, yes, place is something that's important, and that's something that comes up a lot in initial conversation around place-based learning. And so it can be, when I say place is something that's rich in history and culture and traditions, a lot of folks are like, yeah, that makes sense to me. But a continuation of that is how we look at place and how we look at our engagement with that place as a whole. Whether that is acknowledging the history of a place when we go within. So one of the things that we discuss a whole lot with our exchange team is this idea of savior mentality. And sometimes when we go into an area that we perceive to be lesser, perceive to be more impoverished, or perceive to be, sort of more down on the luck, we have a tendency to rush in and want to be that savior. We are engaging with this in a new way to look at how community can be formed in a new productive and a new collaborative and a focus on unity, but also at the same time empowerment of marginalized communities. Working with the indigenous community of the Lakota Nation within South Dakota, this is something that is at the precedent of our thinking for the St. Louis Degree Exchange Program. The indigenous community as a whole within the United States has faced a slew of marginalization, of alienation, of oppression, and overall genocide and cultural and ethnic cleansing that exists since the founding of this nation. So as we live a post-colonial, as Kieran Kessler and Dr. Paul Moriarty talked about in these last 2 weeks, and also a post-genocidal country, as Dr. Lindsay Kingston will talk about, the way that we interact with these indigenous communities is so important for how we rebuild our communities going forward. And this plays into the idea of place. I would argue, and I think this would be in addition to what Ethan DeMumbrum and also Dr. Kleiman would argue with our research, is to say that place can be have more genuine connection with the person studying it if they are willing to immerse themselves in that place itself. So this can expand out so many different ways. Dr. Kate Parsons has talked about how study abroad needs to be more accessible for students as a whole, especially more marginalized students and students of lower income statuses. Bridge Builders, the reason that we fundraise so much is to offer our programs that quite often could be on the upwards of $2,000 to participate in students, to offer it to $125 or less for all of our exchange program members. This is because we don't want anything to be a deterrent, especially financially wise, from anyone participating in the programs, because we believe that offering this style of learning or this exchange program model in the future to students and young folk and basically everyone that would like to immerse themselves in a culture or learn more about a place or a community, we will find that with place-based learning, even within this 2-week exchange program, individuals are able to have more of an impact on their education in this 2 weeks than they are, for example, an entire semester of a university level class based on the same subject. And so this of course will not necessarily stand in the place of or in lieu of a in-house university class, but I think the argument that we're trying to make is that this style of learning is incredibly important for our community, for our young folks going forward. And this ties into the intersectionality of a lot of different social issues, including with racism, with sexism, with all the isms that exist within our world, with the systems of oppression and with intersectionality issues such as environmental justice, tying into things like environmental racism and ecofeminism that we've talked about in BridgeCast in the past. And so through engaging with these programs, the exchange programs like St. Louis Dupree Exchange Program, exchange program members are not only immersing themselves in the culture of, say, St. Louis or Dupree, they're immersing themselves in many intersectional issues that exist within our both communities. And that, for example, we could look at the 2014 protest in Ferguson and see how they're also connected with environmental justice issues and issues of water sovereignty, land sovereignty, and also at the same time that autonomy of marginalized communities to make for themselves and make in the governance and logistical and infrastructure making for their communities. Now, this goes without to say that the third tenet of place-based learning is that humans are placemakers. And what ultimately this means is that you cannot have a place, I would argue, without the humans within it. And that at its surface level makes a lot of sense. To say, yes, you can't have a home, you can't have a culture, you can't have a community without people to exist within that community. But if we dive in deeper to what this means for our communities, we have to put at the forefront what it means to be St. Louis or what it means to be Dupree. And we have to look at the people that exist within those communities. And at the same time, uplift and empower the individuals within that community, which is why we believe that the exchange program is one of the most pressing activist issues that exist currently. Because looking at long-term change for our community in a direction that all of us can sort of get behind on, this has to be, grassroots, this has to be groundwork level, this has to be incredibly meaningful and genuine in how we participate in community. And the exchange program has been revised, has been pondered over, has been incredibly worked upon day after day and year after year to be the best chance of us doing this. So one of the things that we're doing to sort of prove this and talk about this further is that Ethan DeMumberum, myself, and Dr. Kleinman have been developing a oral history project, if you would, for exchange team members who have participated in exchange programs over a period of time. We believe that an archive of some sort, an oral history archive of people who have participated in the programs will be beneficial in showing long-term how these programs can be beneficial and impactful for young folk, for students, for people overall, in long-term understanding of cultural immersion, of cultural competence, of leadership, of community building and community engagement, and as at the same time developing further an idea for how people can engage with their communities, with their families, and with our world. Webster University has a program called the Global Citizenship Program, and we've been pulling a little bit from that to talk about the ideas of cultural competence, which is the overall goal of the GCP, or the Global Citizenship Program through Webster University, to see how our young folk can engage better in cultural competence. And when I talk about cultural competence as a whole, it doesn't necessarily mean just understanding of another culture, but at the same time being competent in how to interact with a different culture, being someone who can be sensitive to different issues, sensitive to how different cultures interact and traditions, history, everything from cuisine and from music to the history of that culture. So looking at St. Louis, looking at the history that St. Louis has had, even going back as early as 2014 within Ferguson, but going back even further to the founding of St. Louis to notice why we were placed in the place that we were located at on the river of Mississippi, and also at the cross section with the Missouri River, and why we're called the gateway to the West, and what implications that has for our city going forward, and looking at the immigrant population that exists within St. Louis, the refugee immigration, refugee status of citizens within St. Louis, and how we are a unique city in that way. And the same goes for Dupree, and looking at the Lakota people and the history and traditions of that community and culture going forward. So going back to the research that Dr. Kleinman, Ethan DeMumberum, and I are working on, what is to document is to look through how this is impactful, to ask exchange team members to reflect on their time and the exchange program to sort of expand and also at the same time validate the claims that we have to the importance of place-based learning, of study abroad programs, of travel programs as a whole, cultural immersion programs as a whole, outside of, vacations or outside of service projects. This style of exchange program isn't necessarily just to build a house, it's to immerse yourself in a culture and to spend that time reflecting, to spend that time learning and developing yourself as a leader for your community, a leader for your family and for your friends, but also to develop your person to be more content and culturally aware as a whole. Again, this is something that is very hard not to get behind, right? Offering the opportunity for our young folks, and when I say young folks, between the ages of 16 and 25, but anyone outside of those age ranges also can benefit from these styles of programs. And looking at the long-term development of our community as a whole, in addition to wonderful ideas like shelters for displaced individuals, for more social care and social work, for more accessible education, for more sustainable practices from businesses, from energy. We want to also encourage our citizens, encourage our community members to go for outside education, to get an opportunity to travel to a different community, to act in a way that is humble, that is responsible, that is sensitive, and to be vulnerable and engage with the issues of that community, and to see how your community is perhaps struggling in the same way and see how this community has either dealt with that issue or felt the same issue. Looking at the Dakota Access Pipeline and the protests that happened at Standing Rock, with the water protectors driven a lot by the Lakota tribe, but many other indigenous tribes and non-native individuals joined the movement happening there. There's something to be said within our own city of St. Louis. St. Louis, looking at where our water comes from, looking at how our water is treated, looking at how water affects different neighborhoods or different areas of St. Louis in different ways, and how sometimes that disproportionately affects marginalized communities. This, nonetheless, with indigenous activists claiming to be water protectors within their community of Standing Rock, within the reservation, within the Cheyenne River Reservation, and within Dupree, we can look at something very similar and say, this is something that makes a lot of sense for me. That is an issue within our own community. Let's collaborate. Let's be vulnerable. Let's, at the same time, sort of compare and contrast the issues that exist within both of our communities, and how can we create a better solution going forward amongst both two people. So that's a general overview of place-based learning. I am, I just asked recently Dr. Kleiman to come and join our conversation, and so hopefully we'll see him next week or in following weeks to talk further about place-based learning, because he's one of the individuals that can really speak well to this topic as a whole, and then how Bridge Builders can sort of be a testing lab, if you would, to this learning theory and how well it can interact to make a better difference within our community, within our young folks, and within activists and leaders as a whole. So that's generally my introduction to place-based learning, engaging a little bit more about how Bridge Builders can go with this. Again, my name is Joshua Krakos. I'm the founder of Bridge Builders STL and the current president. And this is our focus. This is our focus of creating exchange programs that are impactful, empowering, responsible, and at the same time collaborative, cohesive with both other communities, with our teams themselves, and with our communities as a whole. So I thank you for joining us on Bridgecast again. Please join us next week for our guest, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon. Goodbye.